Hello everyone, welcome to Sermon Notes. This week we're looking at Matthew chapter 22, and we're looking specifically at that story of Jesus being confronted by Pharisees who are trying to trap Jesus into saying something that will get him arrested. Well, I thought we could look specifically at some of the people that are mentioned in this story and unpack a little bit about who they are, what they were all about, in order to really get a good, significant understanding of the difference between the kingdom of heaven that Jesus has come to establish and the kingdom of the world that is represented in the actions of the Pharisees. So that's the first group that we'll look at. And then certainly in the actions and life of Caesar Tiberius. That's the second person that we'll look at more specifically. And everything then that the Pharisees represent and everything that Rome and the Caesar represents. So that's what we're going to dig into, and then look at how different that is from the kingdom of heaven. Okay, well, let's dig right in, first of all, then, to the Pharisees. Who were the Pharisees? Well, the Pharisees were a sect of Judaism at the time of Jesus. And in fact, they got going around 200 years before Jesus, around 200 BC, and they were still going until about 100 AD. And so there's a 300-year window there where the Pharisees were a very important and influential sect of Judaism. They were religious leaders at the time of Jesus. They weren't the only religious leaders at that time. There were others as well. Other sects of Judaism and other religious leaders of that time were groups like the Pharisees. Of course, I just mentioned them. There were the Sadducees, I meant to say, but they were very sad, you see. And the Pharisees were not very fair, you see. Terrible puns. But the other groups were groups like the Herodians, the priests, of course, scribes. There were the Essenes, zealots, and there were in every town elders. And so there were lots of religious leaders at the time of Jesus. But the Pharisees seemed to continually come into conflict with Jesus in the Gospels. Pharisees are mentioned about 99 times in the Bible. And most of the time in the Gospels, outside of the Gospels, mostly mentioned with connection to Paul, who himself was a Pharisee but then became a Christian. Well, they continually come into conflict with Jesus because the Pharisees had organized themselves in order to keep the law of Moses, and their organization was around strict observance of the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah was extra writings that are not in our Bible, and these extra writings were a way that the Jews began to codify the law of Moses. What do I mean by codify? Well, when the law of Moses said something like, you should keep the Sabbath day holy, and the way that you should do that is by doing no work and carrying no burdens, well, the Mishnah was eventually developed as a way that the Jews could codify what God might have meant by doing no work on the Sabbath. Well, what did he mean exactly? I mean, could we go and get a glass of milk on the Sabbath? Would that be breaking God's law? Well, the Mishnah was developed to say, let's codify that, and let's say, well, you could have one swallow of milk. So you could go do enough work to get one swallow of milk. Anything beyond that would be work. And that's how the Pharisees interpreted the law of Moses. That's not the only example. Let me give you another one. What about carrying burdens? What did Moses really mean by that? What kind of burden would be too much and would therefore break the law of Moses? When it came to carrying a spoon, for example, there was a measurement around that. That sounds like a burden, carrying a spoon. Well, not, said the Mishnah, if the spoon weighed as much as a fig. Anything more than a fig, and then that would be too much, and it would be a burden, breaking the law of Moses then. Well, this interpretation of the Mishnah was called the Talmud. And so the Talmud was like a commentary, a set of writings to help really understand what was going on in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was there to codify what was truly going on in the law of Moses. So you can see that the Pharisees were trying very hard to make sure that they didn't break God's law. And so they were sincere in that. They really wanted to be pure. In fact, the name Pharisee probably means something like separate or detached. And what they were trying to separate themselves from and detach themselves from was, well, pretty well everything, right? They just wanted to make sure that they weren't impure. Now, they come into conflict with Jesus in the Gospels because in their efforts to maintain their purity, they had actually developed into, or maybe they always were, a group that was more interested in the minutia of the law than the heart of the law. And that's really the most significant part of what's going on with the conflict between the Pharisees and Jesus. They were interested in the minutia of the law and not the heart of the law. Well, this is seen in Matthew chapter 23. Let me read a passage here from Matthew 23, which, by the way, that chapter is where Jesus really comes into conflict with the Pharisees by speaking to the crowds and to the disciples about them. And he says this about the Pharisees. He says this, "Blind guides, what sorrow awaits you? For you say that it means nothing to swear by God's temple, but that it is binding to swear by the gold in the temple. Blind fools, which is more important, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred?" Which is more important, the minutia of this law or the heart of the law? Another example of this is when the Pharisees point out that the disciples of Jesus were picking grain on the Sabbath and eating it. And so you see, they point out and they say that the disciples have been breaking the law of Moses by picking grain that would have been codified as being too much work for the Sabbath, to get that much harvesting done in order to feed yourself. Of course, Jesus brings up the heart of the law of Moses about the Sabbath, which is all about taking a day in order to dedicate yourself to God. And he brings up an example of David, King David, going into the temple place when he is running from Saul and he is ravenously hungry, and the priest gives him the shewbread to eat in that time. The priest then that sees David in this state actually understands that the heart of the law is what's important for David in that moment, and he feeds him. Well, the Pharisees then, who are in such a position of authority in the community, are in conflict with Jesus because their hearts are actually concerned with more of an outward sense of recognition for what they're doing, rather than an inward heart of devotion to loving God and loving others. The term that Jesus uses to best describe this problem that he had with the Pharisees is the term hypocrite. A hypocrite, of course, refers to dressing up to pretend to be one thing, but you're actually something else. It's an acting term. And Jesus uses it to describe the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, the ones at least whose hearts are actually corrupt and evil. I'm sure not all Pharisees were like this. It's possible that Nicodemus was an example of a Pharisee whose heart, sincere for God, actually saw something in Jesus and wanted to legitimately know how Jesus was able to do the things that he did. This was not the case, though, for all of the Pharisees. And as a whole, it seems that the Pharisees were hypocrites. Again, in chapter 23, Jesus says, "What sorrow awaits you teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. Well, you see, in this case, Jesus is pointing out that the hearts of this religious group, the Pharisees, were filthy. Jesus is understanding then that what they represent is a kingdom of this world. Greed is one of the things that he brings out. Self-indulgence, fame and greed, two of the powers that work against humanity, are represented here in this religious group. And of all things, they're the ones that are claiming to be able to provide the pathway to God through purity, through keeping of the law, through the following of these ways that the law is codified. Well, ironically, and it's a dark irony, they're actually the ones who are guilty of breaking the law. Inside, they represent the kingdom of darkness. Greed, fame, or self-indulgence are two of the things that are drawn out in this verse. Well, it's no wonder then that they come up into conflict with the kingdom of heaven. And we've seen that in this passage about Jesus and the question of whether or not he should pay taxes to Caesar. I think it's interesting, finally, to point out that when Jesus asks them to show him a coin, the Pharisees give him a coin, the coin, of course, of Tiberius. And I think what's inferred in this passage is that the Pharisees have this coin, and that coin has a blasphemous statement on it: Tiberius, the son of a god. Well, that blasphemous statement on a coin should not be in the possession of Pharisees that are so strictly trying to keep the minutiae of the law. It's obvious that they are standing up with the religious rulers of the time who were colluding with Rome. No wonder, then, that there was conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. Well, there was also conflict between Jesus and Tiberius and what Tiberius represented. Let's have a look now at Tiberius. Well, who was Caesar Tiberius? Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire from AD 14, when Jesus was very young, to AD 37. So just a few years after Jesus died, was resurrected, and ascended. Before Caesar Tiberius, his father Augustus reigned. So when Jesus was born, Caesar Augustus ruled the Roman Empire. Augustus actually was named Octavian before he took on the name Augustus. Octavian was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. So when Julius Caesar was murdered in this coup, Octavian had to fight for control and power to take the throne of his adopted father, Julius. And so he fought against Cassius and Brutus and Mark Antony. I think I got those players right. And eventually, Octavian emerged as the victor and the emperor of Rome, and he was given the name Augustus, or he took on the name Augustus. He was eventually, Augustus, deified by Rome. He was called a god. And therefore, Tiberius was known as the Son of God. And the coin that Jesus looked at when he was trying to be trapped by the Pharisees into being asked whether or not to pay tax to Rome, that coin was stamped with the words Tiberius, the Son of God. Well, Tiberius was not Augustus's biological son. He was the son of Livia, whom Augustus married, and the two biological sons of Augustus died before they could become the emperor. Tiberius then took over, and Tiberius quickly became one of the most dark emperors in Roman history. He was, in my estimation, one of the most immoral people that have ever lived. He was a very reclusive man, called by his contemporaries a very dark person. In my estimation, I think he was paranoid, and I think he was a psychopath. Tiberius was certainly somebody that gave into another power in this world, and that power was lust. And so Tiberius was completely addicted to horrible sexual practices. And it seemed that he could never get enough horrible ideas into his mind around what he could do with sex. And he plunged into, this is a quote from somebody who was a historian at the time of Tiberius, he plunged into every wickedness and disgrace. Tiberius was a psychopath because he would often connect his evil sexual practices with murder. And it seemed like he could never get enough of killing people. And he would kill people for the slightest offenses. And he would torture people in horrible ways. Even the Romans themselves, when Tiberius died, went out into the streets and danced and sang, and it was written down that they were singing of gladness for Tiberius's death, and they said, "Throw his body in the river." Well, this was the ruling emperor of the world at the time of Jesus. And I think that he represents then the kingdom of darkness. And the kingdom of darkness then is all around Jesus as he comes to bring the kingdom of light. You see with the Pharisees, we've pointed out from Jesus' words that they represented a group that was blinded by their self-indulgence, fame, and they were blinded by their greed. And here you have Tiberius ruling the world and blinded by his lust. And so the powers are at work all around Jesus. And perhaps this is an extremely heightened time of the kingdom of darkness in the world. And so such a time for the kingdom of heaven to be established on earth by Jesus Christ. So you can imagine then that when the Pharisees come with this portrait of Caesar Tiberius in their pockets, and Jesus says, bring out a coin, and they present this coin, which blasphemously says, Caesar Tiberius, son of God, that there really is a juxtaposition taking place then between the kingdom of darkness, there with the Pharisees and Caesar in that portrait. In that moment, you have all of that which represents the kingdom of darkness, all under a title of Son of God. And then you have in that moment the real Son of God representing the kingdom of light, or the kingdom of heaven, representing God's presence itself. That's why I think this is such a powerful story for us, because we can see in that moment then that what Jesus is going to do to move forward in this kingdom of heaven is going to be in opposition to the kingdom of darkness. It's no wonder that Israel certainly wanted to rebel against Rome for being occupied, but certainly for being occupied by such an evil and wicked man as Tiberius. And not only that, but Jesus was able to expose that the Pharisees themselves were bringing about a wickedness in the sense that they kept the people of Israel from coming to and receiving the presence of God. Jesus, however, becomes that pathway. in which people can actually come to God. And how can they come to God? Because they are called by God. Yeah, and so in this remarkable way, Jesus is calling his disciples to come and follow him, his kingdom, in his way. Well, I hope that in the process of being able to look a little closer then at the Pharisees and who they were and who they represented, and then by looking at Caesar Tiberius and what he and Rome represented, we're able to see then just what impact and what need there is for the kingdom of heaven at the time of Jesus. And I'm thankful that he came and established that very thing.